Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. Today we're going to try and round up some of the most interesting information that have emerged recently about the upcoming DLCs of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. We are going to discuss the supposed third planned expansion for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, codenamed Meteor. Then we're going to have a look at some general news about the Wrath of the Druids DLC coming from the LinkedIn profiles of some of its developers. And finally we're going to report on some of the Datamined information, again about the Wrath of the Druids and Siege of Paris DLCs shared by multiple sources over the last few days, and those include potential locations, weapons, item sets, bosses, and more, even though, as usual in these cases, it's always best to always take these pieces of information with a grain of salt. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it, subscribing to our channel, and turning the notifications on so you don't miss any of our future updates. And with that out of the way, let's have a look at the most recent news surrounding Assassin's Creed Valhalla and its future. Let's start with the Meteor expansion. A few days ago, YouTuber xJonathan shared this picture on his Twitter account showcasing an excerpt of the game files of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. As you can see, it does show in a similar fashion a line dedicated to the first expansion of the game, Wrath of the Druids, here called Ireland, a second one dedicated to the second expansion, the Siege of Paris, here called Francia, and a third line dedicated to the potential other expansion, here called or codenamed Meteor. This of course took the community by storm, as there has been no mention of a third expansion/DLC for the game, but it has to be said, the post-launch trailer for the game did mention that the content shown in it only accounted for year 1.
We plan to have 4 of those free seasonal content injected in the first year.
And there have been multiple occasions where official sources stated that the post-launch for Valhalla would have been bigger and stronger than the Odyssey one. YouTuber Rafiti did comment by saying that this might be the Assassin's Creed content that could be released in 2022, potentially ruling out the rumors about a new game/spin-off planned for that window, unless that rumored new game is going to be somehow tied to Valhalla's framework. In any case, it's too difficult and too early to predict this, at least for us. Now, the name, Meteor. We did think that Meteor could be a potential connection to the meteors recently appearing in the game, but then again, in one of his recent videos, xJonathan mentioned that some of these meteors were actually spotted when the game released, so it might not be connected to them. There has also been some buzz about Meteor sounding like Comet, the original codename for Assassin's Creed Rogue, drawing some connections between this potential expansion and that game, but to a degree, Valhalla's main game already has some connections to Rogue, mainly with the Order of the Ancients medallions featuring the Yggdrasil tree, which are so very similar to the one worn by Shay Cormac in Rogue, and also with the mention of the Irish goddess and Isu Morrigan, and her sentence in the Isu language that did remind us so much of the classic I make my own luck. Thus, we're going to wait and see if the ties between Valhalla and Rogue will be made explicit in this Meteor expansion, or whether we're not going to wait that long and will witness them in the Wrath of the Druids DLC. While Meteor could really mean anything, there's also a chance this could be a mythology or first civilization based expansion. In fact, depending on how history based the Ireland and Paris DLCs will be, Ubisoft might still gun for the final fantasy based DLC as it happened with Origins and Odyssey. Next we have some general news and information about the Wrath of the Druids DLC coming from the LinkedIn profiles of some of the devs that are working on the expansion. First of all, it does look that the studio spearheading the DLC will be Ubisoft Bordeaux, not only because their social accounts directly stated that the studio has been working hard on the expansion, but also because some of the most prominent figures working on the DLC, like the assistant art director and the assistant narrative director, are indeed from Ubisoft Bordeaux. More specifically, from the LinkedIn profiles we get confirmation that the DLC will contain new instances of the main features and RPG elements of the main game. So from the profile of Junior Project Coordinator Diana Bejani, we get to know that the DLC will feature new abilities, new skills, new weapons, gear and cosmetics with a progression system that will likely continue that of the main game. The other interesting general information about the DLC comes from the profile of Associate Narrative Director Hugo Sahuke, who mentions a full narrative experience for the DLC with its own universe, narrative arcs, meaning that there will be more than one, characters, stakes, and players' motivations. The Assistant Narrative Director also mentions that he or the team work closely with experts on the culture and history of Ireland in order to deliver an authentic and respectful experience, which seems reassuring. And finally, we get to know that along with him, a lead writer and 3 additional writers worked on the content production for the expansion. So fingers crossed about this DLC when it gets released on April the 29th. Moving on, from this moment onwards, we're going to discuss some of the data-mined information that YouTubers Andy Reloads and again Jonathan found out about the upcoming DLCs for Valhalla, and of course you can find the link to their videos in the description. As we mentioned earlier, we suggest you taking all of this with a grain of salt, as even if what we are going to discuss is part of the game files, it might still not end up in the final product. Moreover, if this does end up in the final version of the DLCs, it might result for some of you as unwanted information, so of course we understand if you'd like to skip this part, but if you don't, let's start. So, for starters, Andy Reloads reported the existence in the game files of Valhalla of a new item set and 3 new skills, which he believes will be made available alongside with the Wrath of the Druids DLC. As for the equipment set, named Mystical Armor Set and mostly centered about poison perks, he believes it to be planned for the Animus store, as it seems to be also accompanied by a naval set and a tattoo set. Once again, the item set itself will be a reskin of the Einar Jar set, which is already available in the Animus store, apart from the helm, which, in Andy's words, is very druidic, so it could be indeed released around the same window as the Wrath of the Druids DLC. The set will also contain a dagger called Jord's Blade, which, as noted by Joe Raptor, is a reskin itself of the Sutunger's Claw dagger that is available in the game. As for the potentially upcoming skills, Andy Reloads showed 3 of them. The first one allows to shoot flaming arrows while on horseback, the second one prompts to shove enemies and NPCs away if you run into them, and the third one allows to snap Eivor to block incoming ranged attacks. Next, Jonathan found what really looked like some achievements for the Wrath of the Druids and the Siege of Paris upcoming DLCs. While we can see some classics like completing the expansion's main storyline, completing specific quests, synchronizing viewpoints and the likes, there are some notable elements that stand out among these. For example, the mention of sickles as usable weapons in the Wrath of the Druids DLC. While many have been thinking of the sickle swords or khopesh that were available in Assassin's Creed Origins, it's more likely that this time we're going to use smaller sickles in the fashion of the ones used by Druids, one of which is even shown in the key art of the DLC. Similarly, it appears that short swords might be available in the Siege of Paris DLC, which is possibly connected to the recent news about one-handed swords coming to Valhalla, which we covered in one of our recent news videos. The potential achievements for Siege of Paris also contain the mention of a Plague of Rats ability, which seems to be used to defeat enemies, and does remind us of what you can see in the game A Plague's Tale. And finally, the viewpoint synchronization for the Siege of Paris DLC does seem to be mentioning France and not just Paris, so it will be interesting to see how much of the country will be able to explore beyond its capital borders. And lastly, we have way more information about some potential characters, weapons, and locations in the Wrath of the Druids DLC coming from the game files as reported once again by Andy Reloads. For the sake of brevity, we're going to show the most relevant elements from Andy's work, as we have also covered most of the remaining info, but we still suggest you check out his latest video in case you'd like to see all the details he found. So, Andy is reporting the potential existence of a Balor character in the DLC, who might be able to deal heavy and light attacks along with an Eye of Fire ability. Balor, as mentioned by Andy, was actually a character from the Irish mythology, the leader of the Fomorians, a group of negative supernatural beings which, as we mentioned in our previous videos, is oftentimes associated with the Jotnar of Norse mythology. Balor was portrayed as a giant with one eye, hence why the Eye of Fire ability mentioned, and in the Irish mythology he was also killed by Lugh of the Tuatha De Danann, the most important supernatural race of the Irish mythology that we also discussed in our previous videos, and Lugh himself was also mentioned in Valhalla's main game in the Isu language files as Lugh the Polymath, through his quote, "In war and in love there is only one goal, the search for a better future." Next, Andy reports the potential existence in the Wrath of the Druids DLC of a spear called Gae Bolg, which apparently might need to be extracted or pulled out. It's not clear if this is going to be a wieldable weapon, but for sure this is a reference to the Gae Bolg, the spear of mortal pain/death that belonged to Cuchulainn, another god from the Irish mythology who was also Lugh's son. Again, it's not clear whether this will be an equipable weapon, but it's very likely to be so. Andy also reported the existence of trade posts in Ireland, which seem to represent the settlement mechanic in the DLC, with a number of buildings to create. He cited a worker house, a storage depot, a raider tent, of course raiding can't be missing, and a main building. According to Andy Reloads, these buildings seem to be tied to different locations in Ireland, so he believes that these trade posts and buildings might actually be located in different places in the Ireland map that might allow to establish an actual trade network. Then again, this might also have to do with what producer Jose Araiza said in the post-launch trailer for Valhalla, hinting at the player being able to influence the trading system of Dublin, which at the time was a bustling trading metropolis. What do you guys think? Would you like to see something like that in a DLC, or would you prefer to see a smaller, more compact version of the settlement, like a camp of sorts? And lastly, Andy reported a huge number of potential locations that might appear in the Ireland map coming again from the game files. Once more, it does not mean that all or any of these might end up in the final version of the DLC, but as you can see on screen, he reported entire counties, the location of trade posts, which might inherently hint also at villages, and even several forts. And that was it for this video. What do you guys think of the news, rumors, and data-mined information we shared and discussed? What are you most excited to see in the upcoming Wrath of the Druids DLC? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.